friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, came up with the question of how are you doing right now? And I think it's, it's all a question of how each of us is doing right now, because I think there are a lot of emotional ups and downs. I think this morning or this afternoon, I'm worried. I'm worried about a bunch of stuff. I'm worried that this moment will become frivolous and end up about not much more than getting rid of Aunt Jemima and, Confederate flags at NASCAR, and we will fritter it away a moment. I'm worried that this moment will get buried in commissions and studies and that we won't act. I worry that this will end with police and not get to schools. And I worry what'll happen when white people get bored and move on to the next issue. So I have anxiety today, but I have hope because all of you are here. And so maybe that is the hopeful thing.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fuller, how are you doing?
Honestly, like I'm blessed. I mean, I have food, clothing, shelter, and money. And my heart aches for all of our people who have very little of any of that. So even though it is a tremendously difficult time, I just think that those of us who have resources, those of us who are able to be on Zoom calls, we should consider ourselves blessed given what it is that's happening to so many people. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you. Earl Martin Phalen, how are you doing in Indianapolis or in Boston?
Yep, I'm in Boston today, but I think we're with Amy and Howard. I think I feel blessed on some days. I feel worried on others, and I feel focused on other moments. We run a network of really 22 schools around the country, and so my worry is some of what Amy shared. I'm very worried about what it's going to be like to go back in the fall, and my obligation and my team's obligation to keep our scholars safe, to keep our families safe, our staff safe, and how do we do that thoughtfully with a virus that's disproportionately impacting the elderly, and also disproportionately impacting the families that we serve.
Thank you. And last but not least, Richard Kahlenberg, how are you doing?
Hi, Curtis. Thanks for having me, and wonderful to be with my fellow panelists here. I guess I'm feeling sad and sad about the loss of Black lives. Also sad to hear the reflections of some of my colleagues and friends at the Century Foundation who are African American and are sharing stories that they hadn't shared before. I'm thinking, for example, of my friend Michelle Burris, who is wondering how, as a Black woman, to protest during a pandemic. She lives with her grandmother, who's 90 years old, and is worried about her safety, and yet feels like she's choosing between keeping her family safe and really making sure to honor her humanity. That's a horrible choice for someone to have to make. So these are somber times.
Well, thank you all for again joining me. This is by far the most popular webinar we've had so far. We had over 10,000 people register, and some are tuning in at Facebook right now. What we want to do is kind of give you a flavor for who's tuning in. And so right now we're going to conduct a survey of those who are on this call. And this will kind of give us an idea of who's listening in and which group they most identify with. And so those who are on the call, we give you an opportunity now, and we ask you to choose which category you most identify with. And I know some may identify with more than one. Are you a journalist, a parent, an educator, an advocate, a policymaker, or a funder? And as I mentioned earlier, some may fall into more than one category, but which category do you most identify with? This will give our panelists an opportunity to sort of understand who's on the call, who's listening in, and to highlight some things about what we're talking about today that may impact your community specifically. And so as we do that, and we'll get the data quite quickly. I do want to start off with you, Dr. Fuller, and this is a historic week. We are 2 days before celebration of what we call Juneteenth, and it is also called the African American Independence Day. And in the spirit of that, it's important that we look back before we go forward. I want to say from 1619 to emancipation, American slave owners inflicted what many call a brutality of ignorance, making education of the enslaved illegal, all while physical and mental brutality was permitted and even promoted. Dr. Fuller, what was America's vision for enslaved Blacks prior to emancipation, and what role did education play? And more importantly, has that changed? What is America's vision for Black students today?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Curtis. So this is the way I would respond to that. Being stuck at home, I actually have just about finished an American Dilemma, and I'm on chapter 7 of Black Reconstruction. And the interesting thing about the American Dilemma by Gurner Myrdal, which was published in 1944, is he talked about the Negro problem. And what I would argue is that this country is still grappling with the Negro problem. And what he said was the reason why they used that terminology was that it was something that was on the minds of all of the citizens of the United States at one point or another. And he made the point that through generations, it has disturbed the religious, the moralists, the political philosophers, the statesmen, the philanthropists, the social scientists, the politicians, the business people, and plain citizens. And so what I understand we're dealing with as I try to respond to your question is what is the essence of the Negro problem? And so when Du Bois was talking about it in chapter 6 of Black Reconstruction, he was talking about what did America think was going to happen with Black people? And so he said initially during the colonial period, there was the thought process that we would be converted to Christians and we could become a part of the American fabric. But that idea went away pretty quickly. The next thought was that we were going to die. And so people need to understand that a lot of the motivation behind stopping the slave trade was to keep more of us from being brought here. Because the thought process was that if we stop them from coming, those who are here will die off. The third proposition was, as it became sort of clear that we weren't going to die, and that ultimately they were going to have to do something with us, and particularly after we fought in the Civil War and Lincoln reluctantly allowed us to be soldiers, the theory was that on the other side of that, we need to deport them. And so everybody needs to understand that Lincoln was at the forefront of the effort to colonize Black people. And that's actually how Liberia got started, as most of you all know. So the thought process then was, okay, if they are going to live, then we got to get them out of this country because they can't function in this country with white people. And then the fourth thought, of course, was the one that the Confederacy had, which was that we were born to be slaves and that it was God's will that we be enslaved and controlled by white people. So if you look at those four things, and then you stop and ask the question, well, what about education? The reality is for a significant number of people in this country, there was no idea that we should be educated. And as those of you know, when we came out of slavery, and I put it this way, we were liberated, but we were not free. And what Black people bought into was the idea that the best way for us to actually become free is to become educated. And so we came out of slavery without the capacity to develop our own institutions. So we needed help. Two groups of white people descended on us, the missionaries and the industrialists. And each one of them had their own view about what kind of education we actually needed. And so when I look at the world today, it's the same. It is that we're still struggling to define in a self-determining way what is the best education for as a people. And what we have is we have industrialists and missionaries, Reed Foundations, TFA, all the people I love, coming into us, and each one has their own idea about what type of education we need. And all of the so-called progressives, excuse, I know that's in y'all's name, but a lot of the so-called progressives, their view is that we all should be in the one best system, that we should all have to go into the traditional public school system because that's what's best for us. And so you got these so-called progressives like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and all of them opposing charter schools, for example, which really means that they are in opposition to the self-determination of a people. And so what that means is still, all of these years after slavery, we still have people who want to control what type of education is best for us. We still have people who want to tell us that either you ought to go into technical or you ought to go into this or that, but you shouldn't control and be able to define your own destiny when it comes to education. So for me, we've come so far and we've come nowhere. And I think that is in general what it is that is happening in American society. So I want to stop there because I know.
But no, thank you. And you said something that I want to throw to Amy, which is self-determination. But before we do that, I do want to give us a chance to see the results of our survey. About 44% of our groups are educators, another 42 are advocates, a few policymakers and funders, but a large number of educators are on the call, and advocates, keep in mind. Amy, I think what Dr. Fuller touched on is something I want you to follow up on. As early as the 19th century, and I appreciate the reference to history. Free Blacks were establishing schools in the North, but also secretly in the South, even before emancipation. Even after emancipation, newly freed Blacks moved quickly to open up schools in the South, to the surprise of a lot of the missionaries and others that Dr. Fuller mentioned when they came South, many of which became historically Black colleges. How do you explain Black determination through everything that Dr. Fuller mentioned, but also how that Black determination shows up now in 2020 for all those parents who are advocating for education even now?
I think, to sum it up, the best way is, our people will always make a way. I mean, that is what we are about. That is what we've always done. You can't see it right out in the hall next to my office. There is a diploma from 1894 from the Atlanta University. That was my great-grandmother's diploma. A Black woman graduating from college in 1894 was an unusual thing, right? But her mother, a former slave, worked hard to make sure that all 4 of her girls went to college. On the other side of my family, my great-grandfather moved to fucking North Dakota to get his girls education. What I think Howard is saying is there have been structures of education forever for our people that didn't necessarily work well for our people. And what you see time and again is Black parents working to get the best available for their kids. If that means moving, if that means building structures around their schools, you have Black parents who have always been and continue to be deeply determined to get what their conception of the best education possible is. And I think that's a lot of what the STEAM and the charter movement is Black parents saying, I want what is best for my kids, but our choices and our limits are often defined by the sorts of forces that Howard raised. I'm not sure I would call them just the industrialists and the missionaries. But we as a people are determined to get good educations for our own kids, good educations for more of our children, but those efforts are continually, foiled and hobbled. And I don't know, what I would say is Black people don't give up, and we're not done yet. That there is lots of work that continues to be needs to be done, and that we need, that we can't run out of steam. And again, in this moment, I think that there is kind of a springboard moment to move forward for Black kids in Black schools, but we have to be careful not to fritter that away.
Thank you. And that determination showed up, particularly in education, perhaps in the most impactful way that at least history celebrates it, which is the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. That really tried to say even the schools that were being opened by African Americans, being funded by folks like Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington and others, that they were still in many ways separate and unequal. And even though that landmark decision ended government-sanctioned segregation, it also had some unintended consequences. One meaning the dramatic reduction of Black educators, many of whom were barred from teaching in so-called teaching white students integrated schools. But also, until today, America struggled to regain the percentage of Black educators pre-1954. Another unintended consequence of Brown were local policies to ensure residential segregation that perpetuated de facto school segregation and unequal funding. And so, Richard, I want to come to you. In your work, you examine the costs and benefits of socioeconomic integration as an alternative to racial segregation. What are the impacts of racial segregation on K-12 education today? And what are some of the impacts socioeconomic integration could have, particularly on Black learners?
Well, Curtis, that's a great question. I guess I'd make two broad observations. First, we have to begin with the fact that racial segregation, both in housing and schooling, was really designed as a tool of white supremacy. So if you're seeking to dehumanize Black people and subjugate them, it's important to segregate into separate neighborhoods so that white people would not get to know Black people as peers. So in that respect, Brown versus Board of Education, despite the the very real limitations you've just identified, represented an enormous step forward, in my view, for human freedom. And during the years when we actually did desegregate, which is roughly from the late 1960s to the mid to late 1980s, Black student achievement did increase significantly, as Rucker Johnson at UC Berkeley and others have shown. And I think the lesson of that experience is that African-American children, low-income children, if given the right environment, can do amazing things, but that an environment that's segregated by race and class is not ideal. So second big point I would make is that we've learned a lot about how to integrate schools since that earlier effort to desegregate in the 1970s. And I think in particular, there are three things I'd point to. First, today, educators are paying a lot more careful attention to equity within desegregated schools. So as you pointed out, Curtis, there were many Black teachers who were fired during the desegregation era. We know that a lot of schools use tracking to resegregate at the classroom level, which had negative effects on African Americans. The curriculum was not culturally affirming. White and affluent parents often took over the PTAs in integrated schools. So smart integration today looks at all those issues of inequality within the schools. Second thing to mention about the difference between desegregation today and desegregation in the 70s is that today it's really done through voluntary choice and incentives rather than court-ordered busing. And both Howard and Amy mentioned charter schools. Charter schools can be diverse by design. Charter schools can be an important way of integrating through choice rather than through compulsion. Magnet schools do the same thing. They intentionally draw students of different backgrounds together through special programs like a dual language immersion or Montessori program. So these types of programs draw the middle class and keep the middle class as part of the integration effort, as opposed to what you were describing earlier with desegregation. Final thing I'll mention quickly is that modern integration programs do focus on economic status as well as race. And that's true in part for legal reasons, because there are limitations on using race that the Supreme Court has handed down, but also for educational reasons. The research never suggested that African-American students benefit from integration because of something about the whiteness of the skin color of their classmates. It was always that economically disadvantaged students will do better in economically integrated environments where peers are more likely to go on to college, where parents have the flexibility and resources to volunteer in class, where teachers are more experienced. I think, for example, of a school in Louisville, Roosevelt Perry Elementary, that was 50% Black, 50% white. It was beautifully integrated by race, but it was 100% poor. And the school really, really struggled. So now we're looking at both those issues of race and class, and you can see very positive benefits for students in those integrated schools.
Thank you. I want to come to you, Earl. You're on the ground where the rubber meets the road. You see this every day as founder and CEO of Phalen Leadership Academies. And I want to talk about residential segregation a little bit. And, in many ways, we understand that zip codes, segregation by zip code, via local zoning laws, bank redlining, racially restricted housing covenants have been were effective really in replacing pre-Brown segregation in education. How does residency play in how you enroll students? And how has residential segregation impacted how your students performed prior to enrolling in your school? In any way, how has transportation impacted your ability to really serve these students based on their residency?
Sure. I mean, I'll start with my personal story. I grew up in a mostly white community. And when I went to high school, we had 500 students per grade. Ingrid Tucker was a senior. I was a junior. And Eric Smoot was a sophomore. And that was what our school was like. Why was it like that? Because America, even after Brown Board of Education, is still extremely, extremely segregated. And so when I look at our 22 schools, it's somewhat similar. It's what is your neighborhood like? And in our neighborhoods, unfortunately, I chuckle a little bit because there was a little bit of a movement to say charters are responsible for resegregation of children. That is the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard. It's our housing and it's some of the things that you mentioned. Traditional public schools are mostly segregated. Charter schools are segregated. Private schools are segregated. Parochial schools are mostly segregated. It's based on the neighborhood in which you live, and our neighborhoods remain deeply segregated. Prior to PLA coming in, we turn around underperforming schools because we're trying to break the system, right? The system says, if you grow up low income, you're going to go to a school that's less resourced. It's not going to give you the educational support and opportunities you need. Therefore, you're not going to be able to get the job or the college pathway that you need. Therefore, you remain living in poverty and the cycle continues. And so we go in and try to break that cycle by providing high quality schools. One of the things we've seen is massive change in culture, massive change in expectations. Our parents are always involved, as Amy shared. They want the best for their scholars, as Howard shared. Our parents want the best for their scholars. And once they start to see and feel that we care, we love, we believe in their children, they are our greatest allies. And I think to your question of kind of the residency piece, one of the things I have to mention is, I am so frustrated by a lot of things, but the level of violence that is allowed to exist in the neighborhoods in which we serve is absolutely deplorable. We tried to get some leadership in Indianapolis to coalesce, come together and come up with a plan, and we came up with really nothing. There's no leadership as it relates to gun violence and its impact on our children, our families, and our neighborhoods. And I'll just share one story. One of our scholars, Tavion, after a terrible night with 4 young people being killed, came to school and had 2 things to say. She said, "I'm okay, Mr. Phalen, but I did run to school because I didn't want to stay at my bus stop. I didn't want to stand at my bus stop because I felt like a moving target was going to be harder to hit than a standalone target." And the second thing she said was, "I've learned now I sleep with my feet by the window, because at least if a bullet comes through my window, it'll hit me in the leg and it won't be good, but at least it won't hit me in the head and kill me." That's the neighborhoods that our children are growing up in. And I hope that there's some action and some activity amongst our quote unquote leaders to actually address the terrible situations in which many children, families are forced to live.
Thank you. And I do want to highlight, and obviously you're a pretty humble guy, but my understanding, you run the largest Black-run charter school network in the country. And for those of you who, are talking, thinking about, this conversation, while the overwhelming percentage of students who attend charter schools are Black and Latino, the percentage of founders is in the 10, 11%. Amy, you know better than me, but it's a fraction. And so, that being said, I wanted to throw up another survey, and I did it because I want to touch on a potential solution that folks may think could address racism towards Black students in America. And we're going to give you these 5 choices. And the question is, what's the most effective way to reduce racism towards Black students? 1, Black-run public schools in the spirit of Earl Martin Phalen. Elimination of schools funded on local taxes. Dramatically more Black educators. Universal choice within districts, giving students the opportunity to attend schools outside of their zip code, but within their school district, really breaking down some of these residential segregation we talk about, but also more autonomy in what and how we educate all students on Black history. At first, I was going to, we talked about potentially just saying how we educate Black students on Black history, but understanding the importance that all students understand Black history is also an option. So at this point in time, if you could vote on these, which you believe is the most effective, and some may say, well, I like this one, I like that one. We're asking you to give us your number 1 choice, and then we're going to come back to the results. I want to shift a little bit to solutions. And I want to come back to you, Amy and Dr. Fuller. But before we get to solutions, I'd like us to agree on what success looks like. And so that we can kind of look, to envision this world that I think many of us wake up every morning right now fighting for. And so, Amy, again, some may or may not know your history, but you are part of a tradition of leaders like your great uncle, Roy Wilkins, who was the president of the NAACP during the Civil Rights Movement. And, what did success look like to him and many of those during that era who will look at this era as, something they were aspiring for or not? I mean, what do you think those who were fighting for civil rights in the 60s would say about where we are right now as it relates to education of African Americans?
Well, for my Uncle Roy, I mostly talked about family stuff with him. I think maybe the person who I can talk about better is Kenneth Clark, who did the doll test, for Brown, and who I worked for when I was in college. And I think that there are 2 things that I think are maybe that sit beside each other in a way that I'm not sure about, and I don't know how to process, but I'll give it to the group so you can try and think about this. 1 is that the doll test always bothered me, and I used to fight with Dr. Clark about it all of the time. If what happened was you give Black kids a set of dolls, and they pick the white doll instead of the Black dolls, the more attractive, why is school integration then the right answer? As you just said, yep, you're right. The better thing is the white one, right? Why is it that only the nice things you can only have nice things if you share them with white people? I think we should be able to have nice things that are ours. And so I've always been confused about how the doll test was used and why we sort of said, if we are going to go to good schools, that we have to sit next to white children. We should be able go to nice schools where we sit next to Black kids. I think if you asked Uncle Roy and if you asked Kenneth Clark, and if I think you asked most Black people, what does success look like? It is Black people having the intellectual tools to control our destiny. That's what I think education, that should be the product of a good education, is that we are intellectually equipped to impact a larger culture that is hostile to us. And so that education has to be seen as, and for lack of a better word, seen as a weapon for both, a sword and a shield. And I would say we haven't gotten that far. You know, Dr. Clark testified after the Kerner Commission. And I'm worried about that happening again. We know a lot of what's wrong in the education of Black children. We also know a lot of what to do about ensuring that Black kids get a good education. And we may not know everything, but we know too much to like waste more time studying the problem, admiring the problem. I mean, we gotta support all the Earls out there that are doing the right thing for Black kids and not, get lost in a series of commissions and studies. And I don't know if I answered your question, Curtis.
No, I mean, I think, that was excellent. I think it gets back to the Black determination, Black self-determination for education that I think Dr. Fuller mentioned and others have mentioned in the past. Dr. Fuller, I do want to come to you because you are in the tradition of Roy Wilkins and Kenneth Clark and others, and have made a life advocate.
No, he's not in the tradition.
As far as advocating for Black children, let me just clarify. The tradition of advocating for
Howard.
Black children. But you recently made news, Dr. Fuller, engaging with Democratic presidential candidates on education. What were you fighting for? What vision for America did you convey to those at the federal level who were running for the highest office in the land?
Okay, so before I answer that, Chris, I want to say something, and I'm probably like an outlier on this panel, but let me just say this. I think that those options that you gave to people about how to eliminate racism, that those are not the right options because it assumes that education is the reason why people are racist. And what I want to be clear about, we're not going to help Black children deal with racism in America by teaching them Black history. We're going to help Black children deal with racism in America by eliminating racism in America, which is going to be very difficult because racism is woven into the fabric of American society. And so what we have to be absolutely clear about is the reason why people are killing us, the reason why cops are killing us is not because they lack education, it's because they don't respect our humanity. And so if we truly are going to help Black children, what we got to do is to change the very nature of the society. I agree that it's important for Black children to understand Black history, but you can understand Black history and still have a cop put his knee on your neck. And so therefore the solution to that problem isn't found in your knowledge about yourself, which is critical. It's also found in understanding the very nature of the systems that oppress us as a people. And so one of the things I wanted to do too was respond to Earl, because Earl talked about one aspect of a problem. That is that there's violence in our communities. What I worry about is if you study violence in communities, it's a class problem. It is a problem of lack of resources, and what happens is because disproportionately that happens in Black communities because we're disproportionately poor, it gets racialized. And so what I'm trying to do is to say that when we attack these problems, we have to be really careful about how we define them, because if we're not careful about that, we fall into the trap of ultimately being able to, quote, blame the victims and just say that, if you all would just lift yourself up by the bootstraps, or if you all would just quit doing this. And what it allows it allows people to not have to confront the structural nature of the oppression. And so I think it's really critical that we step back for a moment and we look at these various systems. And what we have to understand is the reason why the education system does not work for us it was because it was never supposed to work for us. And that the very structures that we're dealing with, not only they didn't work for us, they were structured in a way to oppress us. And so as these demands are being made today, we need to be careful that those of us who are in this don't come up with these moderate notions about what it is that's happening at a point in time where we need radical thinking, radical departure from existing structures and power relationships. And I want to say one last thing, because I thought what Richard said, about integration and everything, but I'm not an integrationist. but I'm also not a segregationist. What I believe in is what Martin Luther King said. And people always like to quote King. Oh, Dr. Martin Luther King. Let me quote Dr. Martin Luther King. So in 1967, speaking to the Georgia Teachers and Education Association's annual meeting in Atlanta, Martin Luther King said this: I support genuine integration. What genuine integration means is that you do not liquidate everything that was started and developed by Black people. There are too many Americans, whites and Blacks, who think of integration merely in aesthetic and romantic terms, where you just add a little color to still predominantly white controlled power structures. We must see integration in political terms where there is shared power. And I am not one that will integrate myself out of power. Integration does not mean Black annihilation. Integration must lead us to the point where we share the power that all of our society will produce. So I just wanted to get that in while I had a chance. I don't even know if it had anything to do with your question.
No, I appreciate that. And I do want to give opportunity for those who did vote to see at least some of the responses, because I think the spirit of these responses, and they're pretty much equally distributed, except for Black-run schools, which is actually surprising to me, because that's actually one of the ones I probably would have voted for. But you do see interest in elimination of, how schools are funded now, who actually is teaching, whether the folks in front of the classroom reflect the students behind the desks, options to be able to move outside of those districts where the poverty and the concentrated class structure that you are. But at the same time, I understand that, students who are going into our public schools are receiving racism from school leaders, from classroom teachers, from the very politicians who say they care about them, are perpetuating a lot of these things. What I did want to do is sort of get it to you, Earl and Richard, and get a little bit more into, solutions. And so, Earl, while the majority of your students are Black and low income, in 2017, all 4 of your schools in Indianapolis were rated A on the Indiana State Report Card, and 2 of them ranked 4th and 5th in academic growth in the city. Schools like yours, while successful, educate only a fraction of the students in the areas which your schools are located. What does success look like for your Black students, but also for other students who don't attend your schools?
Well, I was watching 13th Amendment documentary this weekend, and I had the same feeling that you described. Wow, I'm so proud of my scholars. I'm so proud of my teachers and school leaders, but we've got to get more aggressive in creating great schools. So our plan really is to go from 20 schools to 200 schools over the next 5 years, and really try to get hundreds of thousands and then one day millions of children the quality of education that they deserve. As you know, Curtis, right now 5 million kids every day are going to schools, well, not during this COVID piece, but are going to school in these abysmal places that almost give no opportunity or no pathway towards their innate greatness. And so we kind of define what it looks like for our scholars, and that will also be my answer, what it looks like for all of American children. We kind of say, hey, listen, for us personally, we beat district, beat state. After 2 years, you're blowing out the host district's schools. After 5 years, you're outperforming the state average, and you set yourself up for some greatness and future opportunities. The second thing that we look at is, candidly, character, right? We want love, empathy, honesty, courage. Those are characteristics that a lot of our leaders today actually could use more of. And we want to make sure that as our scholars come out, that they have they have the foundational academic skills to win, but they also have the character pieces strongly built that will lead them forward. We want our scholars to be leaders. A lot of schools, and I disagree with this, are kind of militaristic. They're no nonsense. If my scholar, if I say, hey, let's line up and we're going to head left, I want them to ask why. I want them to question authority. I want them to, and I want us as educators to be able to answer, well, we're going to go left because of X, Y, or Z. And that's just obviously a minor example, but we're not trying to beat out of our scholars their questioning of systems, of people, of quote unquote leaders. And we want that for our scholars. And then the final thing I'd say is we really want to make sure our scholars' beliefs are high. I mean, the reason we want our scholars to walk across their graduation stage with both a diploma in one hand and a CTE in the other that allows them to make $40,000 as a starting salary coming out of high school, plus benefits or more. And we actually are offering those programs next year to their family as well. So 40 plus 40 makes 80, and all of a sudden now you have much more mobility. As Dr. Full was saying about the poverty piece, now you have much more mobility as it relates to what you can do economically. But the reason we do that is we need our scholars to believe in themselves, and you have to build up that belief. When you see a lot of stuff for a long time, it has a way of kind of dampening what you believe you can do, where you believe you can go, and what you aspire to. And so we're trying to do that through our schools. And that's what I'd like to see for all of America's kids. I think we all have tremendous God-given innate potential. And I think our education system tramples that for most children. And we're trying to reverse that and open it up for our scholars.
Richard, can what Earl is doing be replicated nationally under the current system of education and education funding? And if not, what needs to change?
Yeah, well, let me say a couple of things. First is I have tremendous admiration for what Earl is doing. And I love that idea, asking questions. Why do I need to go left? Why do I need to go right? That's exactly what we need. Earl and I were talking about this earlier. Unlike most of his Harvard Law School classmates, he didn't go. He's not busy defending corporations, helping them get richer. He's out there doing really hard work and supporting kids. And so I think the first step would be, let's figure out ways so that we can understand more fully what Earl and what other successful leaders are doing right, and try to take that to scale as best we can. Having said that, I would say on a parallel track, in addition to supporting those efforts, that we also need to look hard at the data and the negative effects of concentrated poverty, and so try to address those questions. There is research from Doug Harris at Tulane University, which finds, yes, there are high poverty schools that are extremely successful. Let's figure out what they're doing right. But the other reality is that middle class schools, economically mixed schools, are 22 times as likely to be high performing as high poverty schools. And that the concentrations of poverty themselves, the research suggests, imposes barriers to opportunity for kids. So for example, if you look at the scores of students on the National Assessment for Educational Progress in 4th grade math, and we look just at low income students, those who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, those students who are in economically mixed schools are as much as 2 years ahead of low income students who are in high poverty schools. So I think there have to be efforts to try to deconcentrate poverty in this country. Curtis, you mentioned the important issue of funding. I think that's a key to this issue of equity. We know there is a tremendous inequality of funding of schools. And that is part of the reason that high poverty schools aren't performing as well on average as economically mixed and middle class schools. But having said that, there is something about the concentrated poverty itself, apart from funding, that matters. And we know that in particular from a study of Montgomery County, Maryland public schools right outside of Washington, D.C., where Montgomery County educators try to do two things to improve the education of low-income children. The first intervention was to spend about $2,000 more per pupil in higher poverty schools. And they spent it on good things like reduced class size in the early grades and better professional development for teachers, extended learning time. And there were some benefits to that. On another track, they said, they have a housing intervention, which says, let's allow low-income families to live in middle-class neighborhoods, send their kids to middle-class schools. And a researcher at the RAND Corporation, Heather Schwartz, looked at these two interventions. They said, which works better? And she was able to look at students who were in families that had applied for public housing in Montgomery County, took whatever they could get because it's scarce. And so they were essentially randomly assigned, some to these higher poverty schools that spend more per pupil, some to the lower poverty schools that spend less. And over time, it became very clear that the low income students who had a chance to go to economically integrated schools performed far better than those in the high poverty schools. In places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, they've tried to take this idea to scale across the district so that everyone goes to an economically integrated school. You see African-American students, Latino students, low-income students, all graduating at 10 to 20 percentage points higher than comparable students in Boston. So I think we need to move forward on both those fronts, trying to improve high poverty schools, but also trying to get at one of the major sources of inequality in this country, which is the concentration of poverty in schools.
So solving this will not be easy because in America, education policy is local, over 15,000 school districts. At the same time, race and poor educational outcomes by race are consistent throughout the country. And so as we move into this segment, I want to talk solutions. I want to give you all opportunities to come up with ideas. If you were advising policymakers at the local, state, and maybe even federal level, what policies would you pass to ensure that we begin the process of eliminating racism in K-12 education? But also, what do you think white educators, white leaders, and those in the funding community know? What do you think they should know? What do you think they can be doing? Those who are listening in and saying, I'm an ally, I want to be supportive. What do you think I should know? What do you think I can do to address this? And so that's two questions. What policies do you think we could pass at the local, state, and maybe even federal level? But also, what are within those outside of the African American community who care about Black and brown learners? What should they know, and what can they do? And this is open to anyone.
I'll start. I mean, one of the policies, and I heard Richard's comment, one of the policies significantly increased funding, first and foremost for our teachers, and then second, make sure that we're able to run the programs that we know support our scholars. So small group interventions work for children in terms of driving results. Access to technology work for children. Summer learning programs work for children. We know the things that work, but the per pupil in the states, at least we operate, don't allow you to cover. So I'd be advocating for that policy for sure. The other piece I'd say is, as we think about in terms of advocates who want to make a difference, I'm turning on and I'm seeing some just major gifts. Reed Hastings, over $100 million to historically Black colleges. I've seen other major gifts. I just want to make sure that as folks decide to be philanthropic, that they don't take the past for being the future. There were a lot of kind of previously historically funded Black organizations that did great things in the 60s. And now if you ask anybody in the community, what are they doing to help Black and brown children? Nobody in the community would know. So just be very thoughtful about who you're investing in and what they're able to actually deliver for our young people. And then the final thing I'd say is just high expectations. I know we had a lot of educators on here, but I know a lot of our educators have incredibly high expectations for our children and scholars. And I think some parents have found out just how hard it is during this COVID piece to be a teacher. It's one of the hardest professions, and it's one of the most important professions, in my opinion, in the country. And so that's what takes me back to my first piece, which is we've got to find a way to get more compensation for our teachers, and we've got to find a way to fund the programs that work for children.
Thank you. Amy.
Yeah, I think I would endorse everything Earl said, but add two things. One is be very, very clear on the data, and I'm responding here a little to Rick. race and class are separate things. Be clear when you're looking at your data, when you're looking at race data, and when you're looking at class data. And Rick, the example you gave of Montgomery County and Cambridge was in fact class data, not race data. So we need to be clear about the challenges we're talking about. And the fact is that the race gap is now bigger than the income gap, that even middle class Black kids are falling behind middle class white kids. So we have to be there when and how we're addressing race and when and how we're addressing class. And those two things come together sometimes and they separate sometimes. But we cannot, and white people do this too often, conflate race and class, and we need to be clear as glass on that. We have a lot of educators on the phone, and I would say this: y'all need to be you need to be brave and look at what collective bargaining agreements do and the role of collective bargaining agreements in perpetuating the undereducation of Black kids. We have to ensure that collective bargaining agreements don't funnel our best teachers away from predominantly Black schools. We have to be careful that collective bargaining agreements aren't funneling money out of Black schools. And you know, in this moment, and again, this is one of the things I'm worried about, it is very easy to focus over there and say, oh, you know, the police are the problem, the police are the problem. Our education enterprise has a lot of problems that it is going to take educators to stand up and say no more, and that we are not putting up with this anymore. And so I would say educators, we really need to look internally about what we're doing to these kids.
Thank you.
So maybe I'll jump in because I feel like Dr. Phalen deserves the last word. So I'll just, and I do want to echo what Amy is saying. You're absolutely right. Race and class are two distinct things. In the Montgomery County intervention, it was an income-based intervention, class-based intervention, but 87% of the families that were in the program were in the public housing program were African Americans. So there was a positive benefit for African Americans in that study. But I take your point, and it's absolutely right. These are distinct issues, and we have to be careful in the way we talk about them. In terms of the intervention for trying to reduce racism in the public education system, clearly no silver bullets out there, but there is a long line of research to suggest, from Linda Trop and others, that integration, when done well, reduces racial bias. It is simply much easier to demonize and dehumanize Black people when for white people they are an abstraction rather than classmates. So it does make a difference. And I would point, of course, to Thurgood Marshall's famous observation that unless our children begin to learn together, there's little hope that people will ever learn to live together. And in terms of advice for white people and how to be allies, I think there are a number of things, but part of what is important is to talk to neighbors and colleagues about why integration is good for everyone. The politics are difficult here. I've often said there's a close to a social science consensus that integrated schools are better than segregated schools by race and class. And then this kind of political consensus that there's nothing you can do about it. And I think that's wrong. At the Century Foundation, we've identified about 100 school districts and charter school chains that are consciously trying to educate students of different backgrounds, bring them together. These entities are educating about 4 million students, and they're making some progress on this issue. And a wonderful new colleague of ours at the Century Foundation, Stefan Lallinger, is heading something called the Bridges Collaborative, which is going to bring together 50 school districts, charter school groups, and housing groups to figure out really a path forward for integration. So I think that has to be part of the solution. And I will footnote by saying Dr. Fuller's invocation of Martin Luther King is absolutely right. We're talking here about authentic integration, not integration which robs Black people of power.
Dr. Fuller?
Yeah, Chris, I just think that these questions and these conversations are always so difficult. You don't have enough time to really get into them, and et cetera, et cetera. But I do want to say this, man. Somebody asked me about a year ago, 2 years ago or something. They said, if you could make a change in education and you could change the curriculum to make it more, inclusive of this or that, or you could raise the minimum wage, which one would you do? I said, raise the minimum wage. And the reason why I'm saying that is because when I look at what's happening to our children, and again, I separate racism from racial oppression. And so my issue is right now, trying to get rid of people's concepts about me as a Black person is not as important to me as getting their knee off my neck. And so therefore, if I could institute change so that I could ensure that my kids would have decent housing, that I could ensure that my kids would have health care, that I could make sure that their families would have the economic resources that they need to make sure that they come to school not hungry, that they come to school with the things that they need. To me, that is going to be at least as important as to whether or not they get taught Black history. Because in the final analysis, right, the thing that worries me the most about my kids are just the lack of resources that they have to function as human beings in the richest country in the world. And then I have to worry about the fact that even if we teach them Black history, and they have to be walking down the street and they get stopped by a cop, they could end up dead with all their knowledge of Black history in their head. And the reason why I'm approaching it this way, Curtis, is not because I don't think that the things that my fellow panelists are raising are not correct. What I'm trying to get at, though, is that the structural oppression of a people can't be eliminated simply by educating them better. Ultimately, we have to do something about the fundamental conditions that put them in that place in the first place. But I know there's a dialectic, and I'll end this way. I know that there's a dialectic between ideas and people's practice. So I'm not saying that the education and giving people, culturally responsive, all that, I'm not saying that those things are not important, because they are. But if you were to ask me what is primarily the most important thing, I would say it's changing the fundamental living conditions of the vast majority of my kids.
No, thank you. Thank you very much to all of you. I think those who are listening and those who tuned in to be educated, to be motivated, to be challenged, and to be left a little bit uncomfortable were. And so I think in that spirit, we definitely, I think, fulfilled the mission I had for this, which is for people in many ways to leave with, in many ways, more questions, which is nothing wrong with that. I was very clear about, understanding that how do we begin the process? As Dr. Fuller mentioned, this idea of racism in America, a value pretty much that, the country was founded on, will not end in K-12. But for many people, the question is, should a 5-year-old walk into a building and also have to face the same racism they face outside? Should they feel unsafe? Do they feel that they're not being, a full citizen, being looked upon as if they were less than, being educated, being funded, all the different things that we believe are systematically unfair, immoral, and everything else? Can our K-12 system be any different? And so I think for us, we understand the importance of obviously, creating a world in which schools sit that is more fair and more just. At the same time, I am, just to be quite honest, teaching my children about Howard Fuller, about his story, about the Orangeburg Massacre, about history, with the hopes that I could pass the torch on to him and my daughter and others who will continue this fight to make sure this country lives up to its ideals long, long ago, and teach them about Roger and Roy Wilkins, and go to the African American Museum and learn about Earl Martin Phalen one day. We are part of a long tradition of African Americans and allies who are trying to get this country to live up to its ideals. I hope we got a little bit closer today. I appreciate you all for your work. Please feel free to reach out to me directly if you want to get in contact with any of these speakers today. Amy Wilkins, Dr. Howard Fuller, Richard Kahlenberg, and Earl Martin Phalen. Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody who tuned in. Have an excellent day, and let's continue the fight to make America what we know it can and should be. Thank you.